Dame Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was one of the most famous movie stars of classical Hollywood cinema. She began her career as a child actress in the 1940s, gaining enough popularity through the next decade to become the world's highest paid movie star of the 1960s. Her beautiful jet black hair, mesmerizing violet eyes, and her emotionally charged portrayals of strong-willed and fiery women captivated audiences. Known for her unique beauty, glamorous lifestyle, and many tumultuous love affairs, Elizabeth remains an international icon to this day. In 1999, the American Film Institute ranked her the 7th greatest female screen legend of all time. Elizabeth was born to American parents Francis and Sarah Taylor on February 27, 1932, in London. In 1939, when Elizabeth was 7, the family moved back to the U.S. and settled in Los Angeles. Through her father's connections as an art dealer to the entertainment industry, a young Elizabeth was introduced to the chairman of Universal Pictures, the second largest movie studio of the time. She was signed with Universal, only to be dropped shortly after her debut in the poorly received film There's One Born Every Minute in 1942. Luckily for Liz, she was picked up by MGM Studios, who offered her a short-term contract and cast her in the film Lassie Come Home. MGM was seen as the golden studio of the era, and after her star-making performance as Velvet in National Velvet, Elizabeth became their latest golden child. Elizabeth's mother, Sarah, was a true stage mom, protective, overbearing, and superficial. When Elizabeth was born, her mother prayed for her daughter to be pretty, and she was the catalyst behind Liz's early career. At MGM, Sarah defended her daughter to ensure she was being treated and compensated fairly, but she also closely controlled Elizabeth's image, up until Liz got married to her first husband. At 10 years old, Elizabeth was enrolled in school at MGM, and she described her childhood from there on out as being lonely, with very few friends or other children her age around. Elizabeth was raised at the MGM studio lot. The 1950s saw a seamless transition for Elizabeth from child actor to adult roles, beginning with the 1950 comedy Father of the Bride. Elizabeth had a mature face, with hair so dark and eyes so striking that on the set of Lassie Come Home, a studio executive asked her to take off her mascara and eyeliner when she wasn't wearing any. Her appearance helped in her transition into more serious parts, and she received critical acclaim for her performance in the drama A Place in the Sun. Elizabeth went on to play a variety of roles throughout the decade and made waves with her mature screen persona, that of a glamorous, passionate woman unafraid of expressing love and anger. Her roles in Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and Suddenly Last Summer highlighted Elizabeth's unique skills. Elizabeth won her first Academy Award for her performance in 1960's Butterfield 8 for playing a call girl who falls in love with one of her clients. Elizabeth made history for her role in the 1963 three-hour epic Cleopatra, being the first actor ever to be paid $1 million for a role. On the set of Cleopatra, Liz met and fell in love with her co-star, British actor Richard Burton. The duo began an affair during filming, divorcing their respective spouses and marrying each other shortly after, creating one of the biggest scandals in Hollywood history. The couple went on to make several films together, including Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. Liz won her second Academy Award for her performance as the volatile but sensitive Martha in Virginia Woolf. Elizabeth appeared only intermittently in films, Broadway plays, and television films after the mid-1970s. After putting the film industry fundamentally behind her, Liz turned her attention to a cause dear to her heart, the fight against AIDS. Motivated in part by the death of her friend Rock Hudson, Liz established the American Foundation for AIDS Research in 1985. She was one of the first global celebrities to speak out and show support for the cause. Her activism helped raise more than $270 million since the mid-1980s. In 1991, she established the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, which is still actively providing direct services for those suffering from the disease today. In 1993, she received the American Film Institute's Lifetime Achievement Award, and for her activism and charitable work, she received the French Legion of Honor in 1987 and was made Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the year 2000. Liz had suffered from pain, addiction, and illness her whole life, which ultimately led to her death on March 23, 2011, from congestive heart failure in Los Angeles, California. She was 79. Along with her beauty, activism, and acting ability, Elizabeth Taylor is most known for her 8 tumultuous marriages to 7 men over 5 decades. Each marriage came with its own set of highs, lows, and lessons along the way. Elizabeth married her first husband, Conrad Nicky Hilton, heir to the Hilton Hotel empire, at the age of 18 on May 6, 1950. They met at LA's Macambo nightclub in October of 1949. During that time, Liz was already involved with other notable men, but she was looking to move away from her mother's overbearing presence, and she saw the socialite playboy Nicky as the chance to gain the independence she was dreaming of. Their wedding was a massive media event, orchestrated by MGM. With 700 guests in attendance, along with 3,000 screaming fans outside the ceremony, it was an extravagant and lavish Beverly Hills affair. The studio supported the marriage, believing it would help in their goal to paint Liz as an elegant, grown woman. During their 3-month-long European honeymoon, Elizabeth quickly realized that she had made a mistake. Nicky was a big partier and was known to get violent after drinking too much. And after only a few weeks of marriage, he turned his anger towards Elizabeth. The two had little in common, and Nicky would go out most nights alone. Liz realized that her vision of a marriage had been, as she later told Life magazine, very naive. His alcohol-induced anger led to emotional and physical abuse. The abuse was so bad that Liz ended up suffering a miscarriage during one of his violent outbursts. After the honeymoon, Liz went home to her mother and filed for divorce. She was granted a divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty on January 29, 1951, 8 months after their wedding. Elizabeth left her marriage to Hilton, scared, sick with stress, and back in the control of her mother. She was lonely and looking for safety in her next relationship when she met her second husband, English actor Michael Wilding, while filming in London in 1951. Michael was 20 years her senior and met Elizabeth on a film set once before. She had a major crush on him for years. He asked her to dinner, and the pair quickly hit it off, making their relationship official. Elizabeth felt safe with Michael, comparing being with him to an island oasis, free of pain and drama. They were married on February 21st, 1952, in an intimate 10-minute ceremony with a handful of guests, though there were thousands of excited fans waiting outside the London Registry office. Elizabeth wanted to show the world that she was approaching this relationship differently, and that she had matured. At the beginning of their marriage, Elizabeth was attached at the hip to Michael, feeling lost without him. They moved back to LA and over the next 3 years had 2 sons together, Michael and Christopher. As time passed, Elizabeth relied on Michael less for emotional support and began to assert herself more, something Michael did not appreciate. Michael's failing career was putting a strain on their relationship. Their power dynamic and age gap started to become an issue as Michael was uncomfortable with Elizabeth's stardom and breadwinning ability. She wasn't the little housewife he wanted, and he wasn't the dominant lover she craved. Elizabeth wanted a man of passion, someone who was strong and could be her equal. So, after 5 years of marriage, they were divorced on January 26, 1957. A man of passion is exactly what Elizabeth found with her third husband and King, Academy Award-winning film producer Mike Todd. The two met in 1956 at the Macambo nightclub in Los Angeles. Sparks were flying from their first meeting. Mike was enchanted by Elizabeth's beauty and charm, while Elizabeth was intrigued by Mike's larger-than-life persona and extravagant lifestyle. They stood near each other, and Elizabeth recalled having a weird but overpowering feeling, as though my spine was tingling. They had a whirlwind romance. Mike showered Elizabeth with expensive gifts, grand gestures, and constant affection. They would talk on the phone for hours, and Mike would send her audacious presents when they were apart. One time, sending an entire plane of flowers to her movie set. Mike was also the instigator for Elizabeth's lifelong love of jewelry, buying her a 29.4-carat emerald-cut diamond that Elizabeth referred to as a friendship ring when they first started seeing each other. Elizabeth was 3 months pregnant with her daughter, Elizabeth Frances, when she married for the third time in an extravagant ceremony in Acapulco, Mexico, on February 2nd, 1957. The wedding was a spectacle that included a 30-tier cake, a dazzling firework display, and an estimated 200 journalists invited to cover the wedding of the era. It was the third marriage for both the 24-year-old bride and her 59-year-old groom. Underneath their glitz and glamour was genuine affection. Elizabeth found Mike's passion, generosity, and protective nature very appealing. He offered a sense of security and stability she craved. They were playful, loving, and completely enamored with each other. Mike was never jealous of Liz's success or shied away from her fame. He encouraged her acting career and even planned to cast her in his upcoming film. Tragically, their story was cut short. Only a little over a year after their wedding, on March 22, 1958, Mike's private plane, the Liz, crashed near Grants, New Mexico. The plane suffered engine failure, sped out of control, and crashed, killing all four on board. Their marriage is the only one of Liz's that did not end in divorce. Elizabeth, who had planned to accompany Mike but stayed back due to illness, was left devastated. Elizabeth would continue to refer to Mike as her first love and as one of the great loves of her life, next to Richard Burton and her jewelry. At the age of 26, Elizabeth found herself a mother of three, a two-time divorcee, and now a widow. After Mike's death, Elizabeth was in a deep depression. She had lost her king and was feeling hopeless about the future. That was when she found herself turning to the only other person who was hurting over Mike's death as much as she was, his best friend and best man at their wedding, Eddie Fisher. Eddie was married to actress and friend of Elizabeth's, Debbie Reynolds, when his entanglement with Liz started. While Mike was alive, the two couples were close and would travel publicly together. Eddie worshipped Mike, and Elizabeth was looking for any way to keep Mike alive. This emotional desperation and shared grief gave way to misplaced feelings of love between Liz and Eddie. When the news of their affair broke to the media, Elizabeth was immediately painted as the Scarlet Woman, the villainous homewrecker who ruined the marriage of America's sweetheart, Debbie Reynolds, when in reality, the marriage of Debbie and Eddie had been on the rocks for a long time. The media also scolded Elizabeth over Mike's death, believing her relationship with Eddie had started too soon after his passing. Elizabeth lost the sympathy of the public and many friends and supporters in her real life. Elizabeth was married for the fourth time at a synagogue in Las Vegas after having converted to Judaism after Mike's death. In their marriage, Liz liked feeling needed by Eddie. She hoped just making someone happy would be enough. She needed Eddie too. He pulled her out of her depression and joined her in grieving Mike. But as she came out of grief, the cracks in her relationship with Eddie became clearer. The couple would remain married until 1964, when Elizabeth began her affair with married actor Richard Burton, a betrayal that enraged Eddie against Liz, so much so that he once threatened her with a gun towards the end of their marriage. The most iconic love story in Hollywood history would have to be the tumultuous romance between actors Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Their larger-than-life connection shook Hollywood to a stop, captivated audiences for decades, and made the Burtons very, very wealthy in the process. The pair met briefly for the first time at a party in 1953. Richard was a budding British actor, and Elizabeth was already a movie star. Richard described seeing Elizabeth for the first time. A girl sitting on the other side of the pool lowered her book, took off her sunglasses, and looked at me. She was so extraordinarily beautiful that I nearly laughed out loud. She was unquestionably gorgeous. She was a dark, unyielding largeness. She was, in short, too bloody much. Elizabeth, on the other hand, found Richard to be pompous and vulgar, and chose to ignore him. Their official first meeting took place 9 years later on the set of the film epic Cleopatra in Rome. Elizabeth was playing the titular role in what was her largest part to date, while Richard was playing her lover, Mark Antony. Richard reintroduced himself by asking Liz condescendingly, "Has anyone ever told you that you're a very pretty girl?" She was less than impressed. In her 1965 memoir, Elizabeth recalls thinking, "Here's this great lover, this great wit, the great intellectual of Wales, and he comes out with a line like that." Richard had a reputation as a playboy, and Liz was determined to not be another one of his conquests. But that changed on their first day of shooting together. Liz found compassion in seeing Richard, who was painfully hungover, trembling through his lines. And the sparks started flying during their first onstage kiss in Cleopatra's boudoir. They both described the kiss as if they were drugged, intoxicated by the electricity. They ended up shooting the scene multiple times, with their kiss lasting longer with each take. Their affair, dubbed Le Scandale by Richard, was hot and heavy, and it wound up consuming both their respective marriages. Their romance launched a worldwide media frenzy that marked the beginning of modern celebrity culture. They knocked the Cold War off the front pages of Rome's magazines. So much so that in 1962, Vatican City's weekly newspaper published an open letter that charged Elizabeth with erotic vagrancy because she was sleeping with Richard while married to Eddie. Rome's Il Tempo news outlet called Liz an intemperate vamp who destroys families and devours husbands. People were fascinated by their shameless lifestyle. Cleopatra was a huge success at the box office, thanks, in part, to Les Scandales. People wanted to go and see their sexual chemistry on screen. Elizabeth and Richard were married on the 8th floor of the Ritz-Carlton in Montreal on March 15, 1964, with a handful of guests in attendance. The ceremony was simple, but their passion was obvious to anyone in the vicinity. Lavish would be an understatement when describing the lifestyle of the Burtons in the 1960s. Richard loved to spoil Liz, who, in turn, was used to receiving only the best anywhere she went. The two would travel around the world and stay between their many properties in Mexico, Switzerland, Los Angeles, and Ireland. They supported an array of charities and financed a large entourage of extended family and staff. Their excessive spending included buying a $960,000 jet plane on a whim, owning paintings by the greatest artists in history, including Monet, Picasso, and Rembrandt, and Richard using a $1.25 million check as a bookmark. But their most outrageous spending was on jewelry. I introduced Elizabeth to beer, she introduced me to Bulgari. Most notably, Richard bought Elizabeth the Krupp diamond, a 33-carat Asher-cut ring in 1968, and the Taylor Burton diamond, a pear-shaped stone weighing 68 carats in 1969. Needless to say, they created a sensation everywhere they went. Elizabeth and Richard appeared in 11 films together, including The VIPs, The Taming of the Shrew, and their greatest performance together, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. They played an unhappily married couple who beat and fought with each other at the witness of their concerned house guests. Both were nominated for Academy Awards in their respective roles in the film, and Elizabeth ended up winning her second Oscar. The Burtons were infamous for their outrageous and performative fights, which earned them the nickname the Battling Burtons in the press. Our fights are delightful, screaming matches. Richard loses his temper with true enjoyment. It's beautiful to watch. Their arguments were fuel for their lust. We will often pitch a battle purely for the exercise. I love arguing with Elizabeth, except when she is in the nude. But as the years went by, their fights became more sinister when they started to be fueled by drugs and alcohol. Alcohol was the third partner in their marriage. Richard was a raging alcoholic, and Elizabeth was a heavy drinker and an abuser of prescription pain medications. During the filming of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, crew members recall it being hard to tell if Liz and Dick were practicing their lines or actually fighting. Over the course of their relationship, TVs were smashed, hotel rooms trashed, and many bottles of booze were emptied. Richard enjoyed the money and power that the Liz and Dick show gave him, but the lack of privacy and Elizabeth's sensational approach to life were slowly wearing him down. Their inability to have a normal life was a source of unhappiness, and they appeared in multiple flop movies to fund their luxe lifestyle. The Burtons possessed and craved each other one moment and couldn't bear the sight of the other the next. Richard was unfaithful to Elizabeth, and in retaliation, Elizabeth found lovers of her own. The Burtons separated for a while, constantly making up and breaking up, but they were never really done with each other. They had a highly codependent relationship, and they would often be enablers in the other's addictions. Looking back on her time with Richard, Elizabeth said, "We were mutually destructive. Maybe we had loved each other too much." They announced in 1974 that they were getting a divorce, but they continued seeing each other even after the legal separation. The Burtons' second marriage was about as quick and as turbulent as their divorce had been. Their on-again and off-again relationship was fragile, but Elizabeth was not about to give up hope. She saw them as divinely bound to one another, and during one of their more blissful periods, Liz suggested they get married again, and stay married this time. Richard was reluctant. He loved Liz, but he was concerned about keeping his sobriety in check around her. After going back and forth with the idea for weeks, Richard asked Elizabeth to marry him again while on a trip to Johannesburg. On October 10, 1975, they were married for a second time in a secret ceremony on the banks of a river in Botswana. Richard was drinking less, but but got blackout drunk the night before their wedding. Despite this, Elizabeth was in perfect bliss. In a letter to Richard after their wedding, she proclaimed that there will be no more bloody marriages or divorces. But the bliss was short-lived. Their relationship had grown so poisonous that no one wanted them to be together. Less than 10 months after the wedding, they were divorced for a second time. I love Richard with every fiber of my soul, but we can't be together. Elizabeth knew that she needed to make a change. She never gave up on finding lasting love, but she knew her next relationship wasn't going to be a great romance like what she had with Richard. In the summer of 1976, at 45 years old, Elizabeth met Republican Senator John Warner from Virginia. John was asked to escort Elizabeth to a dinner at the British Embassy, which was being hosted by Queen Elizabeth II. Liz had a wonderful time with John. He was handsome, down-to-earth, and well-connected, with big ambitions. The following day, Elizabeth called John and asked to join him for a week on his farm. John's farm was 1,000 acres of rolling hillside and a 7,000-square-foot, 5-bedroom, 1860s estate in Northern Virginia. 5 months after the dinner with the Queen, Warner became the 6th of Elizabeth's 7 husbands, and Elizabeth moved her Hollywood glamour to Washington. Elizabeth became vital to John's 1978 Senate run. Voters came out to meet her, and she enjoyed campaigning and getting to know new people. Elizabeth kept up an exhausting schedule during the campaign. It's what you do for your man. She knew people came to see her. A campaign sticker said, "See Elizabeth, vote for John." People close to Elizabeth later made statements that the reason Warner married her so quickly is so that she could help with his campaign. After a while, the intense schedule started to weigh on her. Elizabeth was trying to play a supporting role, but she was not the kind of person who could bite her tongue or tone herself down. John and his campaign aides wanted to change her from who she was. "I had to go along the party line," Elizabeth said later on. John was a workaholic, and Liz was growing very lonely without her friends and family near. Elizabeth would later say that her time in Washington made her a drunk and a junkie. They divorced in 1982. Elizabeth said of their marriage, "He knew he wasn't the love of my life, and I know I wasn't the love of his, but we loved each other." They remained friends until she passed away 30 years later. Her final walk down the aisle was a spectacle, even for Elizabeth's standards. On October 6, 1991, in front of 200 high-profile Hollywood attendees at Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch, Elizabeth married an unexpected match, a construction worker 20 years her junior, Larry Fortensky. The ceremony was swarmed with press. Helicopters full of paparazzi were flying dangerously close above, trying to get a photo. Elizabeth wanted to fundraise for AIDS, so she started the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation with the money she received from selling exclusive wedding photos to People magazine for $1 million. Elizabeth met Larry at her second stay at the Betty Ford Rehab Center in 1988. Elizabeth made history being the biggest celebrity at the time to openly attend rehab for addiction. Larry was admitted for multiple DUIs, while Elizabeth was back to deal with her addiction to painkillers and drinking. Larry was very protective over Elizabeth during the painful therapy sessions they completed during treatment. Elizabeth was attracted to his normalcy. He grew up in a working-class family, didn't finish high school, and had never been on a plane before meeting Elizabeth. He even kept his construction job for some time after they were married. Elizabeth respected his commitment to remaining himself, but she also wanted to show him her world. Larry tried to be supportive of Elizabeth and her fame, but over time it began to overwhelm him. Elizabeth's friends and close staff were unimpressed with this simple working man and never fully understood what Liz saw in him. Larry left his job, started drinking again, and stayed in his pajamas all day. They divorced in 1966, but Elizabeth never stopped caring for him. They would speak frequently, and Liz provided for him financially up until her death and included him in her estate documents. Elizabeth lived a life devoted to the pursuit of love. Along with her 8 marriages, she also had many affairs, boyfriends, and failed engagements. She was said to be romantically connected to many famous men, including Frank Sinatra, George Hamilton, and even Colin Farrell when she was in her late 70s. She was a woman who loved to be loved, and men were intoxicated by her. When looking at Elizabeth's love life as a whole, you will find that her choice of men followed a particular and steady pattern. Elizabeth constantly struggled to find a balance between a stable partnership and an exciting romance. To find a man that not only enticed her, but also made her feel safe and supported. She teetered back and forth with these contradicting wants with each marriage, failing to find a man that fulfilled both of these roles. With Nicky, Elizabeth was excited to leave the overbearing watch of her mother and MGM, but he was cruel and abusive. Michael was an oasis from cruelty, but she grew bored of him. Mike introduced her to the lavish lifestyle that she would carry forward, but their connection was cut short due to Mike's recklessness. Eddie provided company during pain. She hoped that just feeling needed by someone would be enough, but she couldn't help herself when faced with the electricity of Richard Burton. Richard was everything to Elizabeth. He was just as wild as she was, but their love grew toxic and mutually destructive. Senator John Warner was another escape route for Elizabeth, becoming a farmer's wife, far away from the pain of the Liz and Dick show and from everything that made her Elizabeth Taylor. And finally, Larry was a breath of fresh air. A man who would be happy just to go with Elizabeth's eccentric flow, but their addictions came back to haunt them in the end. Elizabeth couldn't settle for anything less than she thought she deserved. When one style of relationship, the exciting and destructive, or the stable and boring, reached her endpoint, she didn't have any difficulty calling it quits. I adapt myself 100% to my husband's life, willingly and happily. I can be pushed, I can be shoved, and that's okay. I'm resilient as hell. Though I admit, if I'm pushed too far, even by my husband, something snaps within me, and the relationship is over, Elizabeth said after her marriage to John Warner ended. Her son, Chris Wilding, said his mother went one of two ways with the men in her life, and the ones that worked were the men who could be her equal and call her on her shit. On a visit to an AIDS ward, Elizabeth sat in a circle with a group of patients. She told them to ask her anything. One patient asked her, "What kind of grief and sorrow have you had in your life? And who was the love of your life?" Elizabeth answered, "I was married to Richard Burton twice, and he was the most passionate love of my life. Nobody fought more or loved more than we did, but Mike Todd was my first true love." Of all of her lovers, fiancés, husbands, and flings, Mike Todd stands out as Elizabeth's best match. And after his death, she would spend the rest of her life looking for a man who had something in common with him. Mike was a force to be reckoned with. He was tough but caring, outrageous but thoughtful. And he showed Liz that a relationship without passion wasn't one she'd be able to keep for long. It's hard not to wonder when looking at Elizabeth's love life why she needed to marry all of these men, not just be with them. Her childhood at the studio was a lonely one. Everything she did, at home or at work, was watched with a careful eye. From an early age, she was up for public scrutiny and sexualization. Her screen persona of a sexy, passionate, and glamorous woman shaped the way people treated Liz in real life. She believed that the only way out of her overbearing life with her family and at MGM was through marriage. And this association of marriage and independence was kept her whole life. Elizabeth reflected on this belief, saying, "I think I ended up being the Scarlet Woman, partly because of my rather puritanical upbringing and beliefs. I couldn't just have a romance. It had to be a marriage." Elizabeth's granddaughter, Lena Wilding, said that she liked the traditional roles in her personal life, though that's not really how she lived. She wanted to be the traditional mother, wife, and homemaker that most women her age were at the time, but she could never really hold on to this image long enough to make that a reality. At the start of her relationships, Elizabeth would always try to become Mrs. Wilding, Todd, Burton, or Warner, and try to subvert Elizabeth Taylor. Becoming a celebrity at such a young age distorted Elizabeth's emotional maturity. She was stuck chasing the adrenaline rush that only her level of fame could provide. Joe Mankiewicz, who directed Cleopatra, said that Elizabeth and Richard were two actors who don't know how to get off stage. When you have a job so extravagant and thrilling, real life is dull in comparison. Her great loves, Mike and Richard, were the men so larger than life that they were able to fulfill her constant hunger for more. There is no arguing that, even when she tried to run away from it, Elizabeth enjoyed the excessively glamorous lifestyle that her celebrity provided. She always wanted more love, more jewelry, more food, more painkillers, more pleasure, more excitement. She loved the game of cat and mouse. She loved the makeups and the breakups, and she never stopped believing that she could get any man she wanted, no matter her age. Being a romantic thrill chaser was not easy, and Elizabeth found herself in many difficult situations over the years. Multiple of her husbands have been accused of domestic violence: Nikki Hilton, Eddie Fisher, Richard Burton, and Larry Fortinsky. Elizabeth herself was known to have aggressive and occasionally violent outbursts with her partners. She was addicted to the drama, to the emotional roller coaster. She would call Richard a bore when he was sober, hoping to provoke him to drink and argue. She never really unhooked from her relationship with Richard. Years after their divorce, the prospect that they may never get back together slowly consumed her. It is also hard to ignore the fact that Elizabeth cheated on many of her husbands and broke up a number of relationships over the years. She felt tremendous guilt over the women she had hurt and the instability she had given her own children. Elizabeth expressed feeling used, first by her family, then by MGM, and then by Richard during therapy sessions. She felt he had used her fame to enrich himself and then abandoned her. She said that this was one of the main reasons she became an addict. The majority of Elizabeth's reputation, when it comes to love, was shaped before the sexual revolution. Her affairs, divorces, and commitment to funding AIDS relief are all clear examples of Elizabeth's modernity when it comes to sexuality. Elizabeth was a natural sensualist. She experienced life through her five senses and was very in tune with her body, something women in her era were not encouraged to be. Towards the end of her life, Elizabeth became fast friends with actor Colin Farrell, a man 40 years her junior. Recounting his time with Elizabeth, Colin described a dinner date they had at the Polo Lounge. She wanted to have chocolate-covered strawberries and caviar, and all the things women like Elizabeth should be dining on the regular. She was a sensualist. Her figure was so womanly and Rubenesque and feminine, yet she could out-curse, outshine, out-love, and I'm sure out-fuck. She was a huge power. That was reflected in all of her appetites. Colin described even the idea of getting to love Elizabeth as magical. I fell in love with her in my short time with her. I got the sense of how magical it may have been to have loved her in a romantic way, to have felt the romance of her romantic love. Elizabeth was like the Greek goddess Aphrodite, whose sexual allure was so great that it caused wars amongst mortal men. The many captivating, passionate, and volatile loves of Elizabeth Taylor teach us that a person who lives a life in the pursuit of romance can struggle to remain happy and stable for long, but also that they are free from a lot of the conventions and shames that plague the love and sex lives of others. The great loves that Liz had didn't make for lasting partnerships. Richard Burton's close friend, David Rowe Bedeau, said of their marriage, "They were always in love. They were too much in love to stay married, and they were too much in love to not be married." But her great loves did illustrate the power passion can have in a relationship. Elizabeth's romances continue to add to how we view the most intense forms of love that we see on screen and in our real lives today.